August 15th, 1939, 6 o'clock in the morning. The air over Silesia hung thick and gray, pregnant with moisture that clung to everything it touched. At the military test range near Neuhammer am Queis, the grass was wet with dew, and the first light of dawn struggled to penetrate a ceiling of clouds that seemed to press down upon the earth itself. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the scent of pine forests that surrounded the bombing range, and in the distance, the mechanical growl of Junkers WW2 engines warming up echoed across the landscape like the breathing of sleeping giants, awakening to face an uncertain day. Captain Walter Sigel stood beside his Junkers Ju-87 B-1 Stuka, his leather flight jacket zipped tight against the morning chill. He was 32 years old, a veteran pilot with hundreds of hours in the cockpit, a man who had trained for this moment through countless exercises and simulations. His hands, calloused from gripping control sticks and throttle levers, moved with practiced efficiency as he conducted his pre-flight inspection. The aircraft before him was a marvel of German engineering, an ugly, angular bird of prey with its characteristic inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear. It looked brutal, because it was brutal. This was no graceful fighter, no elegant courier of the skies. This was a weapon, designed for one purpose: to fall from the heavens like a hammer of the gods and deliver destruction with surgical precision. Behind him, 25 more Stukas sat in neat rows, their pilots and rear gunners moving through their own rituals of preparation. These were the men of I.STG-76, the first group of the 76th Dive Bomber Wing, and they were about to perform for an audience of Luftwaffe generals and high command officers who had assembled in the observation area overlooking the target zone. Among those watching would be Wolfram von Richthofen himself, cousin of the legendary Red Baron, and the man who had championed the Stuka program with religious fervor. This demonstration was not merely a show, it was a validation of doctrine, a proof of concept for the weapon that would spearhead the coming war that everyone knew was inevitable, though no one dared speak its name aloud. The weather recon pilot had returned 30 minutes earlier with his report. Broken cloud between 6,000 and 2,500 feet. Good visibility below cloud base. Acceptable conditions for dive bombing, though not ideal. Sigel had frowned at the report, but orders were orders, and the generals were waiting. He looked at the sky again, noting how the grays seemed to deepen rather than lighten as the sun rose somewhere beyond the overcast. Something felt wrong, but he could not articulate what it was. Perhaps it was merely nerves, the natural tension before performing under the scrutiny of men who held careers in their hands. At precisely 600 hours, Sigel climbed into his cockpit, settled into the metal seat that had been molded to his body through countless hours of flight, and began the startup sequence. The WW2 engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with a deep, thunderous voice that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. One by one, the other Stukas came alive, until the morning air was filled with the symphony of synchronized power. Sigel looked to his left, then to his right, checking that his wingmen, Oberleutnants Eppen and Müller, were ready. Both gave him the thumbs-up signal. Behind them, the rest of the formation waited, engines idling, pilots tense with anticipation. The tower gave clearance, and Sigel released his brakes. The Stuka lurched forward, gaining speed as it rolled across the grass strip, the fixed landing gear thumping over uneven ground until the weight lifted from the wheels and the aircraft translated from an earthbound machine into something else entirely. One by one, the 26 dive bombers climbed into the morning sky, forming up into their attack formation at 12,000 feet. From this altitude, the world below became a patchwork of green and brown, forests and fields stitched together by ribbons of road and river. What Captain Sigel did not know, what he could not have known, was that in the 30 minutes since the recon flight had returned, the weather had changed. The broken cloud layer had not dissipated with the sunrise as forecast. Instead, it had thickened, fed by moisture rising from the river valleys below. What had been broken cloud at 2,500 feet was now a solid bank of morning fog extending all the way to ground level, transforming the target area into an impenetrable soup of gray nothing. And because Sigel had no radio communication with the ground observers, no one could warn him. The generals on the ground could only watch and wait, binoculars raised as the distant specks of the Stuka formation began their approach. The Luftwaffe had created the Stuka as an answer to a specific problem. problem. Traditional horizontal bombing from altitude was notoriously inaccurate. Even the best bombardiers using the finest optical sights could miss their targets by hundreds of feet. But if an aircraft could dive nearly vertically towards its target, releasing its bomb from low altitude, accuracy would increase exponentially. The problem, of course, was that diving at such steep angles generated tremendous speed, and pulling out of that dive subjected both aircraft and pilot to crushing gravitational forces. Many pilots had blacked out during recovery attempts, waking seconds later to find themselves hurtling towards the ground with insufficient altitude to correct. Others had simply pulled too hard, overstressing the airframe until wings folded and structures failed. German engineers had solved this problem through innovation. The Stuka was equipped with an automatic pull-out system, a mechanical marvel that would activate when the pilot released his bomb. The system would automatically apply elevator trim, forcing the nose upward and initiating a 5 to 6 G recovery that would pull the aircraft out of its dive even if the pilot lost consciousness. It was this system, more than any other single feature, that made the Stuka not just effective, but survivable. Pilots trusted the machine to save them when human physiology failed. They had to trust it, because without that trust, the psychological burden of repeatedly diving towards the Earth at terminal velocity would break even the strongest minds.
Sigel brought his formation to the initial point and performed his final checks. Altimeter, 12,000 feet. Airspeed, 170 kilometers per hour. Engine temperature, normal. Fuel, sufficient. He looked at his target marker below, though in truth there was nothing to see except the gray blanket of cloud. The target itself was somewhere beneath that shroud, a marked area in the forest where practice bombs would simulate the destruction of enemy positions. He took a breath, keyed his radio, and gave the command his pilots had been waiting to hear. Angriff, attack. Sigel rolled his Stuka into the inverted position, a maneuver that felt unnatural every single time despite years of practice, and pulled the stick back. The nose pitched downward, and suddenly the Stuka was no longer flying, but falling, diving at a 70-degree angle toward the earth below. The dive brakes deployed automatically, perforated panels extending from the wings to control the rate of descent and prevent the aircraft from exceeding its structural limits. The wind across those brakes created the sound that would become infamous in the months ahead, a rising wail like the scream of a banshee, a psychological weapon as potent as any bomb. Eppen and Mueller fell into position on either side of him, 3 Stukas diving in perfect formation, plummeting toward the cloud layer at ever-increasing speed. Sigel's eyes were locked on his altimeter, watching the needle spin counterclockwise as altitude bled away. 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. The cloud layer rushed toward him, gray becoming darker gray, and then he was in it. And the world disappeared. This was normal, expected. He had dived through clouds hundreds of times before. The briefing had said there would be clear visibility below 2,500 feet. He would break out of the overcast with plenty of altitude to acquire the target, make final adjustments, release his bomb, and let the automatic system pull him to safety. But the cloud did not end at 2,500 feet. At 2,000 feet, Sigel was still flying blind, surrounded by gray nothing, with only his instruments to tell him he was still diving at 70 degrees, still accelerating, still falling toward a ground he could not see. A small voice in the back of his mind began to whisper warnings, but training suppressed it. Follow the procedure. Trust the instruments. The clouds would break. They had to break. 1,500 feet. Still nothing but gray. His airspeed was approaching 350 kilometers per hour now, the wind screaming past the canopy with such violence that the entire aircraft shook. 1,000 feet. Still gray. And now the whisper became a shout, became alarm, became terror, because Sigel understood with crystalline clarity that something was terribly wrong. The weather report had been incorrect. The visibility below cloud base did not exist. The base itself did not exist where it was supposed to. He was diving blind toward the earth, and he had perhaps seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. 700 feet. His hand moved to the bomb release, but he hesitated. The automatic pull-out system was designed to activate upon bomb release, but if he triggered it too high, he would abort the attack, fail the demonstration, disgrace himself in front of the generals. If he triggered it too low, he would die. The mathematics of velocity and altitude scrolled through his mind with desperate speed. How much altitude did he need to survive? 500 feet? 400? He had trained for minimum release altitude of 1,200 feet, but that assumed visual reference, assumed the ability to see the ground rushing up and make final corrections. He had neither. 500 feet. And suddenly, impossibly, shapes began to emerge from the gray. Not the ground, not yet, but darker masses within the fog. Trees. He was seeing the tops of pine trees, and they were close, so close that he could make out individual branches. Horror flooded through him, a cold wave of adrenaline that made his vision sharpen and time stretch. He was going to die. They were all going to die. In another second, perhaps two, the Stuka would impact the ground at 350 kilometers per hour, and the resulting explosion would leave nothing but scattered wreckage and a crater in the forest floor. His hand slammed the bomb release lever and yanked back on the control stick in the same instant, not waiting for the automatic pull-out system, overriding it with manual input, pulling with every ounce of strength he possessed. The force of acceleration crushed him back into his seat, crushed the breath from his lungs, crushed the blood from his brain. Gray vision tunneled to black at the edges as his body struggled against forces it was never designed to endure. 6 gravities, 7, perhaps more. The Stuka's airframe groaned and shrieked as metal stressed beyond design limits. The wings flexed upward, bending in ways that seemed impossible, that should have resulted in structural failure, but they held. And the nose came up, and Captain Walter Sigel, vision graying toward unconsciousness, felt the wheels of his landing gear brush the tops of pine trees with a series of small impacts that transmitted through the airframe like bullets striking armor. He was that close, 50 feet. Perhaps less. The margin between survival and death measured not in meters, but in heartbeats. His Stuka burst out of the trees into marginally clearer air, still dangerously low, still fighting for altitude, but alive. Climbing, escaping. Behind him, his radio exploded with frantic voices, and then a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the sickening crunch of impact, followed by another and another. Eppin was gone. Mueller was gone. And as Sigel fought to gain altitude, keying his microphone to scream, "Pull out! Pull out!" to the rest of his formation, he knew with terrible certainty that more were dying as he spoke. The pilots of Stuffle 2 and Stuffle 3, following their commander into the dive, had no warning. They dove into the same gray void that had nearly killed Sigel, but they dove with the confidence of men following a proven leader. When the trees materialized out of the fog, they had no time to react. 9 aircraft from Stuffle 2 went in. 2 from Stuffle 3 followed. 11 Stukas. 22 young men, transformed from living, breathing human beings into scattered fragments of metal and flesh in less than 60 seconds. The forest erupted in a series of explosions as fuel tanks ruptured and ammunition cooked off, sending columns of black smoke rising through the fog like funeral pyres.
Only Staffel 1, flying last in the attack order due to a last-minute change in procedure, survived. Rudolph Brown, one of those pilots, heard Sigel's desperate warning over the radio and had sufficient time to abort the dive, circling above the cloud layer while watching smoke rise from below, knowing that friends and comrades had just ceased to exist. The demonstration, intended to showcase German air superiority and the devastating effectiveness of the Stuka, had instead become the Neuhammer disaster, a catastrophe that killed 26 aircrew before the war had even officially begun. On the ground, the assembled generals stood in stunned silence. They had come expecting to witness precision and power. Instead, they had heard the growing wail of diving aircraft, had watched with mounting horror as the sound grew louder but no aircraft appeared, and then had witnessed the sequential explosions in the fog, understanding before anyone officially reported it that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Wolfram von Richthofen, the Stuka's greatest advocate, felt his stomach turn to ice. This was not how it was supposed to happen. The investigation that followed was swift and decisive. Blame was assigned to faulty weather reconnaissance, to poor communication procedures, to the decision to proceed with the demonstration despite marginal conditions. Captain Sigel, having survived through skill and split-second decision-making, was not faulted officially, though he would carry the weight of command responsibility for those lost men until his dying day. The incident was classified, buried beneath layers of military secrecy, because Nazi Germany could not afford to reveal such a devastating failure just weeks before launching its invasion of Poland. But for the pilots who survived, the lesson was indelible. The Stuka was a precision instrument, capable of devastating accuracy and protected by innovative safety systems, but it was not invincible. It could not defy physics, could not see through fog, could not save a pilot who dove too deep into conditions where no machine could save him. The automatic pull-out system that had become legend among Stuka pilots had its limits. Below a certain altitude, no amount of engineering could overcome simple momentum. What makes this story remarkable is not merely the tragedy of the Neuhammer disaster, but the narrow margin by which Captain Sigel escaped death, 50 feet. The difference between his wheels brushing treetops and his aircraft disintegrating against the ground. 50 feet represented perhaps 1/4 of 1 second at his dive speed. A moment's hesitation in pulling the stick back, a fraction more delay in his reaction time, and he would have joined his wingmen in death. Instead, he survived to become part of a darker history, leading Stuka units through the early campaigns of World War II, participating in attacks on Poland, France, and eventually the Soviet Union. The Stuka itself would become one of the most recognizable symbols of German air power in the early war years. Its distinctive inverted gull wings, its fixed landing gear with aerodynamic fairings, its howling siren, all became synonymous with the blitzkrieg that swept across Europe. The weapon that had failed so spectacularly at Neuhammer would succeed beyond its designer's wildest expectations in the campaigns of 1939 and 1940, striking terror into civilian populations and military forces alike. Polish cavalry, French armor, British destroyers, all would fall victim to Stuka attacks delivered with the precision that the Neuhammer demonstration had attempted to showcase. But the aircraft had a fundamental weakness that would eventually prove fatal to its combat effectiveness. The Stuka was slow. Its maximum speed barely exceeded 400 kilometers per hour, and during the dive bombing attack itself, it was completely vulnerable. The steep dive angle, the deployment of dive brakes, the fixed landing gear creating drag, all meant that once committed to the attack, the Stuka pilot had no defensive options. He was locked into his trajectory, focused entirely on the target, unable to maneuver or evade. Against poorly equipped enemies without significant air defense, this was acceptable. Against a determined enemy with modern fighters and effective anti-aircraft artillery, it became a death sentence. This vulnerability was demonstrated brutally during the Battle of Britain in 1940. The same Stukas that had terrorized France found themselves facing Royal Air Force Hurricanes and Spitfires flown by pilots who understood exactly how to exploit the dive bombers' weaknesses. Stuka losses became catastrophic. Entire formations were decimated. The aircraft that had symbolized German air supremacy became a liability, and after suffering unsustainable casualties, the Stuka was withdrawn from operations over Britain. It would continue to serve on the Eastern Front, where Soviet air defenses were initially less sophisticated, but the era of Stuka dominance was effectively over. The technology that had made the Stuka revolutionary, the automatic pull-out system, the dive brakes, the specialized bomb-aiming equipment, all represented solutions to problems that other air forces solved differently. The United States Navy developed dive bombers like the Douglas SB Dauntless that incorporated similar concepts but with greater speed and survivability. The Soviet Union eventually fielded the Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik, a heavily armored ground attack aircraft that could absorb punishment while delivering devastating firepower. Each represented different philosophies of aerial warfare, different balances between speed, protection, payload, and precision.
precision. What remains most striking about the Neuhammer disaster and Sigel's survival is how clearly it illustrated the margins on which aerial combat operated. The difference between success and catastrophe could be measured in feet and seconds. A pilot's skill, his reactions, his decision-making under pressure, these factors could not be designed into an aircraft or programmed into an automatic system. They were human qualities, fallible and variable, yet ultimately decisive. Consider the sequence of events that saved Sigel's life. First, he had sufficient altitude awareness through instrument flying to recognize that something was wrong even before seeing the trees. Many pilots, especially less experienced ones, might have continued the dive according to the planned profile. Sigel's instincts told him otherwise. Second, he reacted instantly when the trees appeared, not freezing in terror or attempting to analyze the situation further, but immediately executing the emergency pull-out procedure. That instant response bought him the altitude he needed. Third, he overrode the automatic system rather than waiting for it to activate on bomb release, understanding intuitively that he had no altitude to spare. And fourth, he had the physical strength and conditioning to maintain consciousness under the extreme G-forces of the emergency pull-out system, remaining aware and in control even as his body was subjected to forces that would cause most people to black out.
Any one of those factors failing would have resulted in his death. It was not luck alone that saved him. It was skill accumulated over thousands of hours of flying, mental toughness developed through rigorous training, and physical conditioning maintained through discipline. But it was also luck. The simple fortune of being slightly higher in the formation than his wingmen, giving him an extra fraction of a second to react. Eppen and Mueller were equally skilled pilots, equally well-trained, equally brave. They died because they were 50 feet lower in their dive pattern, and 50 feet made all the difference. The survivors of the Neuhammer disaster, the pilots of Staffel 1 who had aborted their dives and watched their comrades die, carried forward a knowledge that would inform their combat flying for the rest of their careers. They understood viscerally, in a way that no amount of classroom instruction could convey, that altitude was life, that weather could kill as surely as enemy fire, that procedures existed for reasons written in blood. Rudolf Braun, circling above the smoke and fog that August morning, learned that following a leader blindly could be fatal, that each pilot bore responsibility for his own survival, that no amount of courage could overcome physics. These lessons, purchased at the cost of 26 lives, would be applied in the months and years ahead as the Stuka units went to war. Minimum release altitudes were religiously observed. Weather reconnaissance became more thorough, with multiple checks before committing to attacks. Communication procedures were improved, ensuring that pilots could receive updated information even after beginning their approach. Formation tactics were modified to provide greater separation between aircraft, reducing the risk of mass casualties if something went wrong. All of these improvements stemmed directly from what was learned at Neuhammer. Yet, despite these improvements, despite the experience gained through combat operations, despite becoming the most famous and feared dive bomber of the war, the Stuka remained fundamentally limited by its design philosophy. It was an aircraft optimized for a specific type of warfare, the blitzkrieg conditions of overwhelming German superiority in the air and on the ground. When those conditions ceased to exist, when Germany faced enemies with modern equipment and determined pilots, the Stuka's vulnerabilities became apparent. By 1943, Stuka production was being phased out in favor of more versatile aircraft like the Focke-Wulf FW190 fighter bomber, which could deliver ordnance with reasonable accuracy while maintaining the speed and maneuverability to defend itself. The specialized dive bomber, for all its precision and psychological impact, could not survive in an environment of air superiority contested by capable opponents. The automatic pull-out system, that mechanical innovation that defined the Stuka's operational capability, represents a fascinating intersection of human limitations and technological solutions. German engineers had recognized that the human body simply could not withstand the G-forces required for dive bombing operations without assistance. Blood would drain from the brain, vision would gray and then black out, and pilots would lose consciousness for crucial seconds. Rather than accepting this as an insurmountable limitation, they designed a system that would continue flying the aircraft even when the pilot could not. It was an early form of automation, a recognition that machines could, in certain circumstances, perform better than humans. Yet the system was not infallible, as Sigel discovered. It required sufficient altitude to function, required time for the aerodynamic forces to take effect and bend the flight path upward. Below a certain altitude, no amount of automation could help. The pilot was on his own, dependent on his own reactions, his own strength, his own will to survive. Technology could assist, but not replace human judgment and skill. This balance between human and machine, between automated systems and pilot control, remains central to aviation philosophy even today. Modern fly-by-wire aircraft have computer systems that can prevent pilots from exceeding structural limits or entering unrecoverable flight regimes, but ultimately a human being remains in command, able to override the automation when necessary. The psychological aspect of Stuka operations deserves consideration as well. Imagine the mental state required to repeatedly dive towards the Earth at terminal velocity, trusting that a mechanical system would save you from impact, trusting that you would maintain consciousness long enough to complete the attack, trusting that enemy fire would not damage the aircraft at the greatest moment of vulnerability. This required a certain type of personality, a certain willingness to embrace risk, a certain faith in technology and training that not every person possessed. Stuka pilots were volunteers, men who had chosen this particular form of aerial combat over other options, and their psychological profiles reflected that choice. The sound of the Stuka's siren, that distinctive howling wail created by wind-driven propellers mounted on the dive brake assemblies, was both a practical warning system and a weapon of psychological warfare. Soldiers on the ground would hear that sound and know with certainty that death was approaching, that somewhere above them a bomb was falling, and there was nothing they could do but seek cover and pray. The terror induced by that sound, the way it affected enemy morale and combat effectiveness, became almost as valuable as the physical destruction delivered by the bombs themselves. This psychological dimension of warfare, the recognition that breaking an enemy's will to fight could be as important as destroying his equipment, was central to German military doctrine in the early war years. Yet psychological weapons cut both ways. As the war progressed and the tide turned against Germany, as Allied air superiority grew and Stuka losses mounted, the sound of that siren began to represent something different to German pilots. It became associated with vulnerability, with slow speed, with obsolescence. The aircraft that had once symbolized German power and innovation became a reminder of how quickly technological advantage could be lost, how rapidly the conditions of warfare could change. Pilots who had once taken pride in flying the Stuka began requesting transfers to fighter units, seeking aircraft that gave them a chance of survival against increasingly sophisticated opposition.
The story of the Stuka and of Captain Sigel's 50-foot survival margin ultimately speaks to larger truths about warfare, technology, and human endeavor. War drives innovation, pushing engineers and designers to create weapons of ever greater capability. But those weapons are only as effective as the tactical and strategic contexts in which they are employed. The Stuka was devastating when used correctly, under conditions where German forces controlled the air and could suppress enemy defenses. It became a liability when those conditions disappeared. No amount of engineering excellence, no degree of pilot skill could overcome fundamentally unfavorable strategic circumstances. This pattern has repeated throughout military history. Weapon systems that appear revolutionary in one context become obsolete in another. Aircraft carriers dominated naval warfare until the development of anti-ship missiles made them vulnerable. Tanks revolutionized ground combat until infantry-portable anti-tank weapons became sufficiently powerful. Each generation of military technology creates its own countermeasures, its own vulnerabilities, its own eventual obsolescence. The Stuka's trajectory from revolutionary weapon to obsolete liability occurred in the span of just 4 years, a remarkably rapid rise and fall that illustrated how quickly conditions could change. For Captain Walter Sigel, standing beside his damaged Stuka in the hours after the Neuhammer disaster, these larger historical patterns were unknowable. He could not foresee the campaigns ahead, the victories and defeats, the ultimate failure of the German war effort.
effort. He knew only that he had survived when others had not, that he had come within 50 feet of death, that the pine branches stuck in his landing gear were physical proof of how close he had come to joining his wingmen in their graves. He knew that he would have to write letters to the families of Eppen and Müller, explaining how their sons and husbands had died following orders. Executing a demonstration meant to showcase German military prowess. He knew that those letters would be inadequate, that no words could truly convey the violence and finality of death in aerial combat, and that the families would receive official notifications speaking of duty and honor and sacrifice, empty phrases that meant nothing in the face of permanent loss. The weight of command, the burden of sending men into situations where they might die, the responsibility of making decisions that affected lives beyond his own, all of this fell upon Sigel in those hours after the disaster. This was the price of survival, the cost of being the one who lived when subordinates perished. For junior pilots, death in combat was tragic but simple. They followed orders, executed their missions, and fate determined the outcome. But for commanders, for leaders who made the decisions that sent others to their deaths, survival brought a different kind of burden, a moral weight that could never be fully set down. In the broader context of World War II, the Neuhammer disaster was a footnote, a minor incident that killed fewer men than died in single minutes during major battles. But for those directly involved, for the families who lost loved ones, for the pilots who watched friends disappear into the fog and never emerge, it was everything. This is the nature of war, that individual tragedies are subsumed into vast statistical aggregates, that personal losses become mere numbers in historical accounts. 26 men died at Neuhammer. In the years that followed, millions more would die across Europe and the world, and those 26 would be forgotten, except for those who knew them personally. Yet their deaths were not meaningless. The lessons learned at Neuhammer saved lives in the months and years that followed. Improved procedures, better weather reconnaissance, more conservative minimum altitudes, all stemmed from what happened that August morning. Every pilot who survived a dive bombing attack because of those improved procedures owed his life, in some small part, to the men who died at Neuhammer. This is the calculus of military learning, that each tragedy ideally teaches lessons that prevent future tragedies, that blood purchases knowledge that saves blood later. It is a terrible calculus, one that no one would choose if better alternatives existed, but it is the reality of how military organizations learn and adapt. The Stuka itself, the aircraft that nearly killed Captain Sigel and did kill his wingmen, continued to evolve throughout the war. Later variants incorporated heavier armor, more powerful engines, different armament configurations. The U-87G model carried 37mm anti-tank cannons under its wings, transforming the dive bomber into a tank hunter. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated Luftwaffe pilot of the war, flew this variant on the Eastern Front, claiming the destruction of hundreds of Soviet tanks. His success demonstrated that even as the Stuka's role as a dive bomber became obsolete, the basic airframe could be adapted to new missions, new requirements. But adaptation has limits. By 1945, Stuka production had ceased entirely, and surviving aircraft were relegated to training duties or simply scrapped. The age of specialized dive bombers had passed, replaced by multi-role fighter bombers, and ultimately by precision-guided munitions that could achieve the precision that Stuka pilots risked their lives to deliver, but without requiring human beings to dive within 50 feet of the ground. Captain Sigel's moment of survival, those few seconds when his landing gear brushed the trees and his aircraft strained against forces that should have torn it apart, represents both the apex of human skill and the limitations of human capability. No pilot today flying a modern combat aircraft would be expected or required to pull out of a dive at 50 feet above ground level. Minimum altitude parameters are programmed into flight computers, and automated systems prevent pilots from exceeding safe limits. The kind of split-second decision-making that saved Sigel's life has largely been automated, delegated to machines that can react faster and more consistently than human reflexes allow. This represents progress, unquestionably. Fewer pilots die in training accidents, fewer aircraft are lost to controllable flight into terrain, fewer families receive notifications that their loved
ones died because they misjudged an altitude or made a split-second error in a moment of crisis. But something also is lost, some element of direct human agency, some sense of the pilot as master of his machine rather than passenger in a computer-controlled system. The debates around automation in aviation, the questions about how much authority should be given to machines versus human pilots echo through military and civilian aviation to this day. The Stuka and its pilots represented one extreme of that spectrum, an aircraft where automation existed but remained secondary to pilot control, where survival depended primarily on human skill and decision-making. Modern combat aircraft represent the other extreme, where automation is primary and pilot input secondary, where the computer will not allow the pilot to make certain errors even if he tries. Neither extreme is perfect. The Stuka killed pilots through demanding too much of human capability. Modern aircraft occasionally kill pilots through automation failures, or situations where computer logic conflict with human judgment. The optimal balance remains elusive, contested, dependent on specific circumstances and missions. For the men who flew Stukas in World War II, these philosophical debates were irrelevant. They flew the aircraft they were given, accepted the risks inherent in their mission, and did their best to survive and complete their objectives. Some, like Captain Sigel, survived through a combination of skill and fortune. Others died, their potential unfulfilled, their lives cut short by war and technology and the simple mathematics of velocity and altitude. Their legacy persists not in monuments or memorials, most of which have long since crumbled or been removed, but in the evolution of military aviation, in the lessons learned and applied, in the slow accumulation of knowledge purchased with blood and validated through survival. The 50 feet that separated Captain Walter Sigel from death on August 15, 1939, represents more than a mere measurement of distance. It represents the razor-thin margin on which survival in combat aviation has always rested, the narrow boundary between success and catastrophe that every combat pilot navigates every time he straps into his aircraft. That boundary exists today as surely as it existed in 1939, though its parameters have shifted with technology. Modern pilots face different risks, fly faster aircraft, employ more sophisticated weapons, but they still operate in an environment where split-second decisions determine life and death, where skill matters, where fortune plays its role. The story of the Stuka, of Neuhammer, of Captain Sigel's survival, reminds us that behind every weapon system, every aircraft, every piece of military hardware, there are human beings making decisions, taking risks, facing consequences. Technology can enhance human capability, can provide tools and systems that improve performance and safety, but it cannot eliminate the fundamental human element of warfare. Pilots still climb into cockpits, still take off into uncertain skies, still face dangers that no amount of training or equipment can entirely eliminate. And when they return, when they survive missions that killed others, they carry forward not just tactical experience, but existential knowledge, an understanding of mortality and fortune and the arbitrary nature of survival that shapes them forever. In the end, Captain Sigel's 50-foot survival margin teaches us that warfare operates on multiple levels simultaneously.
There is the strategic level, where generals move armies and decide campaigns. There is the tactical level, where units execute missions and engage enemies. And there is the personal level, where individual human beings confront their own mortality, make decisions in moments of crisis, and either survive or perish based on factors they can only partially control. All three levels matter. All three determine outcomes. And the margins between success and failure, between life and death, remain as thin as they were on that foggy August morning in 1939 when a Stuka pilot pulled out 50 feet above the trees and lived to tell about it.